Okay, hopefully this will give you a bit more clarity on what we've been talking about, because obviously I haven't explained it very well. So, after the Second World War, there are major problems between the two superpowers. And if you kind of look at this map here, that sort of helps explain it. So, Russia, which has come, or the USSR, which spans right the way across here to across here, has come under very serious attack from the Germans from Europe in the Second World War, but it has also committed to helping the United States against the island of Japan down here during the Second World War. So it's theoretically got this war to fight on two fronts, but it says that it will deal with the German threat first in Europe, and then once that's finished, it will come back and turn its attention to helping win the war in the Pacific, which is a war that went on longer than the war in Europe. So at the end of the Second World War, the Russians have basically pushed right through to Berlin in Europe. Then they have then turned their forces round and they have invaded down here North Korea, which at that point is being maintained by the Japanese. Now, for their part, the Americans have invaded Europe from this direction here, and actually from this direction here up through Italy. But they have also been engaged in a war in the Pacific. You can't really see this blue arrow on the right-hand side here, but striking at, make that black, so striking at Japan, obviously from this direction, from the Pacific, and including basically all this island hopping and taking all this territory before they decide that they're going to finish the war by dropping atomic bombs on the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They also, as part of that process, invaded the southern section of Korea. All right? So when the war finishes, you've got these two kind of lines in place. There's this line over here, where the Russians and Allied forces have met, somewhere in the middle of Germany. And there's this sort of line here in Korea where the Russians and American forces have met in kicking out Japan. So that takes us on to our next map, I think. So here is, in a bit more of a microcosm, the situation in Europe post-1945. So remember, of course, that this is the USSR over here. Let's have that at the back of our minds as we move through. So the USSR has been pushing its forces in a sort of three-pronged attack, really, and pushing the Germans out of the USSR. Now, once it gets to its borders, it continues with this push, and it pushes right the way across Europe like this, and it liberates all of the states that it finds on the way. So, for example, Poland is liberated by the Soviet troops, so is Romania down here, so is Bulgaria. All of these areas are cleared of Nazi forces. Up here is Hungary, and over here is Czechoslovakia. All right, so in all of these states, the Russians are moving the German forces out, so that by the end of the war, we have Russian influence in all of these Eastern European states, as well, obviously, as the Soviet Union, which would look like this back here, and so on, okay? Now, at the same time, as we just discussed, there is landings of the Allies here, the D-Day landings, as well as an American and British advance through Italy here, so that by the end of the war, the Americans, British, French, Canadians, etc., have got this sort of a situation going on in Western Europe. Now, the Russian forces actually come into the eastern side of Germany too. So you kind of have this slightly strange situation at the end of the war where the two sides meet up. The Western sides, that is the British and the Americans and the Canadians, etc., etc., they meet up, they're driving in from the west, Meanwhile, the Soviet Union have been driving the German army out from the east. And they both basically meet up at this central point where both armies come together. Under a series of wartime conferences, both the USSR and the Western powers, that is the British and the Americans and a little bit the French, have come to a series of agreements about what should happen to various countries after the war. Now, the central one here is Germany, and they decide they're going to basically split Germany into four. So this bit here will be the USSR's zone of influence, and then there will basically be three more zones of influence for Britain, the USA, and France. They may not be in that order, I can't remember. They also, interestingly, decide to do the same with Austria, which they basically split into four zones as well, because Germany and Austria had been together in the Second World War. So there are then supposed to be, there are a number of agreements they make then. One of the agreements is that the satellite states, or the areas, the states here, the six of them, there's actually going to be five at this point, I'll explain where the sixth comes from in a minute. These 5 states here should be allowed to have free and fair elections to decide on their future and what type of government they would like to have. The USSR, on the other hand, likes the idea of having these 5 states here as a buffer zone, as a protection from future potential German invasion. So they like the idea of having this shaded red area there as a protective buffer to stop any future German advance or German attack on their position. This causes great controversy because it had been agreed that they would be allowed to have free and fair elections to decide their own fate. Now, down here, we also have 2 more communist countries, Yugoslavia, and then this one here, which is Albania, which are also communist states, but not as tightly controlled by the USSR as these other 5 states are. Now, what this means is that the Americans suddenly become really nervous about the position of 2 countries. This is the first one down here. This is the country of Greece. And this is the country of Turkey, which you can see borders the Soviet Union just here. Okay? Now, the Americans have come to believe, let's just write those in. So that's Turkey. And then down here we have Greece. The Americans have come to believe in something called the domino theory, which suggests that once one domino goes down, the other dominoes will fall in their place. And so they believe that, according to this theory, the next 2 countries to fall, the next 2 dominoes in line, will be Greece and Turkey. And they are seeking to put in place a policy known as containment. Let's write this down here. So they are now seeking to contain communism. They believe that communism is like a disease that will spread and it needs to be stopped in its tracks. Now, it's at this point that our guy Truman comes along and introduces something called the Truman Doctrine, which promises money to both Greece and Turkey to help them resist the attempts by communists to take over their governments. This is successful in the sense that the Greek nationalists win the civil war and defeat the communists, and the Turks also do not go communist. So, in a way, therefore, Truman's actions and his decisions have successfully contained communism in Europe, in that they seem to have stopped the spread of communism at the border of Greece and Turkey, which, if you consider, if we actually were to colour this bit in down here, you can see it belongs to the USSR, is not in any way to be sniffed at as an achievement, because all of this territory is communist by 1949. So Greece and Turkey have held this line. They have stopped communism in its tracks. They have contained it to just those shaded red areas there. Now, I'll come back to discuss the Berlin, Germany thing in another video, but just to briefly say that there is a dispute over Germany. Both sides disagree with it, and ultimately both sides are going to end up forming states, their own states out of Germany, this state here, which is going to become East Germany, which becomes then the 6th satellite state. And then West Germany here, which means that now the two powers kind of face each other in Europe, and they're separated by this border. Winston Churchill will come along and he will call this border here, which I'll now shade in a bit darker, that comes in around these communist countries like that, down to here. He will call this the Iron Curtain, as if to demonstrate the fact that there is now a clear dividing line in Europe between the capitalist West and the communist East, which is now made up not just of the USSR, but also of these various states, 6 of them satellite states, 2 of them not satellite states, but still communist, Yugoslavia and Albania, which sit behind this line in what is a communist sphere of influence. And the only thing that stops this sphere of influence in its tracks is the situation of Greece and Turkey. That's the importance of the Truman Doctrine. In an attempt to reinforce this and make it even more clear, the Americans then come up with this Marshall Plan, which sees them lend huge sums of money to a number of European nations in order to improve their economies and help them come out of wartime depression, which the Americans theorize means that they'll be less likely to be tempted by communist governments in the future, because they believe that communism only really exists when you have poverty and want and misery and despair and all that sort of stuff. And if you can provide economic aid and bolster Western economies, you are then really unlikely to get that communism in the future. Lastly, the Western European powers take steps to protect themselves by forming a defensive alliance called NATO, which commits each member to the defense of others if they come under attack. When you think about the move from isolationism of the early 1920s and into the 1930s, when the Americans were keeping themselves out of pacts or alliances or anything like that, they are now committed to defend European countries if they are attacked by the Soviet Union.